You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This episode is about the philosophy of Stoicism. What is the appeal of Stoicism and how relevant is it? I'm going to share with you clips from 2 bonus episodes that I've done about this topic. These are discussions that I've had with patrons of The Voluntary Life who've brought up the topic of Stoicism in the Q&A live streams that I do with supporting listeners. So I've put these clips together. These are not the full discussions, but they give you a taste of the kind of discussions that we have on bonus episodes. There are now over 70 bonus episodes that you can get access to if you choose to support The Voluntary Life on Patreon or Bitbacker. And if you're interested in doing so, you can check that out by following the links that I'll put in the show notes or on my website, thevoluntarylife.com. So without further delay, here are clips from 2 discussions about Stoicism.
Okay, so I have a question. I read an article a couple of days ago that was about what I would call pop Stoicism. Now, you've talked about the philosophy of Stoicism on your show before, and you've said that you got a lot out of it personally. But this was like a popular take on it. It was written by like a social media guru kind of guy. He was like hashtagging it startup grind and like addicted to success and things like that. And it was like a point by point breakdown of, you know, his idea of Stoicism, which, you know, admittedly, it seemed a little bit, poppy, I guess. One of the things he said was Stoicism doesn't require any study to understand. It should just be like natural. And another thing he said was like everything takes up space and you can't control events, but you can control how you react to them. And it seems like, okay, here's my question. It seems like this type of pop Stoicism is becoming popular these days. Would you agree with that?
Definitely.
Yeah. It's been talked about by like Tim Ferriss and some other people. I just wonder, since you have actually looked into Stoicism a bit deeply, do you have any critiques of the pop Stoicism that's been going around lately? Or do you think it's largely a good introduction? What do you get out of Stoicism in general? And are the pop Stoics picking up on any of the things that you find valuable about it?
I think that's a good question. My issue with Stoicism is that the Stoics that I've read, and that I've read mostly secondary sources summarizing what they've said, I've found it very helpful and useful, but a lot of it is more or less common sense and not that deep in terms of like really giving you a very deep understanding. But what I do get from Stoicism and what I have found helpful is a focus on self-mastery. That is sort of what I think a lot of the Tim Ferrisses and these type of people are generally picking up on with Stoicism, is the idea that in a way, this idea that they talk about with you can't control external events, but you can control how you respond to them. The idea is to really focus in life on those things that are within your locus of control and to make that as big as possible, and to therefore not spend your days being enraged at the general state of the world that you can do nothing about, but rather focus on those things that really are within your control, which generally means yourself and the things that you can do.
Another thing that he said in this article was you have to disrupt yourself in the Silicon Valley meaning of the word. You have to disrupt yourself before something else disrupts you. So basically get out of your comfort zone. Is that like kind of a corollary to what you're saying with the self-mastery?
Yeah, I think the idea with Stoicism is also that life for Stoics is not all about being comfortable, I suppose. That as a part of the process of achievement and growth and fulfillment, there will be things that you'll have to do which are not particularly pleasant. And I think the idea is that accepting that that is the case means that you can actually get more fulfillment out of life rather than avoiding those difficult things that you have to do that are
necessary for personal growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, it's sort of basically the Stoics are saying, push yourself a bit, even though it's uncomfortable, because it's worth doing that in order to grow. And if you only take a view in life that I don't like stuff that makes me feel uncomfortable, then you're never going to get anywhere. Again, I mean, to me, it's kind of common sense.
Yeah, well, that was one of the criticisms that I've heard is like, there's nothing really very unique about Stoicism. Like a lot of philosophies say very similar stuff. Do you agree with that? And do you agree with the idea that Stoicism doesn't require study to understand or integrate?
Well, the way I see Stoicism is this. So in philosophy generally, you had this early enlightenment in the Greek classical period, where from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that sort of period, you had this first flowering of the idea of reason. And it was the first time that humans really started to codify how to think rationally, write down, this is what logic is about. This is how we work out, does a particular proposition make sense or not? And we actually can work out objectively whether or not what I'm saying makes sense or doesn't make sense and so forth. But what happened was in the early period in philosophy, the early Greeks, like the big names like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates before them, they were very, very much focused on using logic in politics, and they were very much focused on society as a whole. So of the biggest example of that being Plato's Republic, where he is basically doing this whole kind of utopian design for society, right? So they thought, we can use reason to redesign the world out there, and in particular to kind of have these grand social engineering plans for society. After that, what happened in Stoicism was it was still very much a focus on reason and using reason to come up with the right path in life, basically, using reason as your guide. But it is an entirely personal philosophy. And so the Stoics were not focused on, I want to go out there and change society and force people to do this, that, and the other. They were all focused on what you do yourself. And the really great thing about that is that gets you to actually change yourself as a way to improve life, rather than, ignoring your own problems and going out and trying to change other people. And that's what I find most helpful about Stoicism, is it's a non-political philosophy that's more to do with yourself, which does mean that there were some rather odd combinations of people who were Stoics. Like, one of the major Stoics was Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, who was actually in charge of the biggest state in history at the time. And another one was a former slave. So they sort of, in a way, I suppose you could say as a criticism, maybe they didn't talk about society enough in that sense. But that's kind of because it was very much a personal philosophy, and it was still focused on using reason and logic and rationalism to as your guide in life. And that's what I find valuable about it. But I will say that I have noticed that a lot of people who are into Stoicism are also, you can be interested in Stoicism and still think that it's a good idea to be in the military and go and be involved in war. And so, I mean, Marcus Aurelius is a good example of that. He was an emperor, right? So I think Stoicism definitely had a lot missing in terms of ethics. It didn't really deal with questions like what constitutes aggression and what is it moral or not moral to do to other people.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Another thing that I picked up on in this Pop Stoicism article was about minimalism, and it said basically you should practice poverty to become a better person, to appreciate what you have more. Try to eat like a really cheap meal for a week every once in a while, just so you appreciate the nice food. Whittle down your possessions because everything takes up space. Now, the first thing I thought about that was like, well, I guess that's true if you go on sort of a spending diet or like a minimalism diet, if you will. You could gain more appreciation for the things you have, and it could put things in perspective. But not everybody really has like the luxury of the choice to practice poverty. Like some people are just poor and they can't get much poorer if they tried. So what do you think about that?
I would say that the Stoics would disagree with that. Really? And yeah, totally. And also I think there is a grounds for disagreement, because the idea is to say, wherever you are in life, whatever you have, then it's your choice to focus on how much you appreciate what you've got and how much you feel hard done by, I suppose. And that's true whether or not you have, a vast amount of disposable income and you're rolling in money. Then the idea is, be aware of this and be aware that also you could lose it all. And that isn't necessarily what life's all about. But also, I think what the Stoics would say is, even if you are poor, even if you don't have a lot of disposable income, you always have choices about how you spend your time in life. You always can potentially spend your time either in ways that are moving you towards your goals or not. And being more aware of that gives you an appreciation for the things that you do have in life. One of the criticisms that people level against Stoicism is that sometimes people say, well, this is just teaching you to kind of, be happy being poor or something like that. I think I can understand that criticism, but I don't take it like that. I take it more to be like, every person has control of their own lives. Even in the direst circumstances, you always have some choices. And, if you really hold on to that and make the most of your choices, then you can, for example, work towards getting you out of bad relationships or getting you out of a bad job or getting you out of a situation that isn't working for you, rather than accepting it fatalistically, which I don't think Stoicism ultimately should lead you to do. It's more like, even though it can seem fatalistic, I take it more as being...
making it into a choice.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Always be aware of
highlighting the choices that you have in any situation.
Right, exactly. And always focusing on your own personal ability to do something about your life. So I think that is very positive. But because I don't really see that many core principles underlying Stoicism that aren't kind of common sense, I think you can probably bend it and interpret it in a lot of ways. And some of them could be more fatalistic, of just like, oh, well, you can't do anything, so just accept what you've got. I mean, the one aspect to that is that Stoics do make a point of saying that things that you can't change, like the inevitability of death, for example, there is no point in stressing out about it, because you can't do anything about it. So you've got to focus on the things that are changeable in life. Of course, the question is, how much can you change? I mean, I
disagree that you can't do anything about death. Like, yeah, you could. No one's guaranteed tomorrow. Life can be short. You can be ended unexpectedly. People can die and get sick. But there's an average lifespan. So you can kind of think, okay, well, my average lifespan might be this, but if I quit smoking, it might be longer. Or if I start exercising, or if I start eating better, maybe it could be longer. So I'm going to do whatever I can to kind of have influence over that. But I could also see, like, yes, I'm going to exercise and eat healthy and take care of myself, because it also provides benefits in the moment and makes me feel good. And that's a choice I have. But also, I'm going to accept the idea that I have no guarantees that I'm going to be alive tomorrow, and just live my life as though I don't want to have any regrets if I don't have a tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the Stoic approach is not to say, like, okay, well, you can't change death, so give up and do nothing. Yeah. It's much more like what you were just saying, that you can't change. There are certain things that you can't change, but you can do a huge amount. Like, for example, you can look after yourself and stay healthy and do all of those things that give you a better quality of life, even though they're uncomfortable in the short term, and they do result in not having the food that you might enjoy eating as often as you'd like to, and not sitting on the couch as often as you might like to, because you got to go out and do exercise and stuff like that. So I found it helpful. I found in particular the book, and we did an episode on this, called A Guide to the Good Life. I found that a really good introduction to Stoicism. So if you're interested, that I think is a good summary about what the best aspects of it are. But there are other books that I haven't looked into that are more the sort of Tim Ferriss guys have done various. There's The Obstacle is the Way is a very popular sort of summary of Stoicism. I haven't read that. Have you read that?
No, I haven't read much about it at all. Actually, my first introductions to Stoicism in general have come from your summaries of the books that you've read, and this pop Stoicism that seems to be popular. Now, getting back to that, let me ask you this. Why do you think it's experiencing sort of a resurgence right now? And do you think people are actually listening? Because I look around and I see people more governed than ever by like what's going on outside in the political climate and the world and stuff. And I don't see that many people like really focusing on their own sphere of influence. You know what I mean? But I don't know. What do you think? Why do you think it's popular now?
Well, I think that to the extent that it's popular, it's because it can be really helpful. And it can be really powerful to focus on the stuff that you can change in your own life and actually make a difference in your life. And there are people who want to do that and want to lead a more purposeful, meaningful, fulfilling life and make and achieve things with their lives and feel like they're using their precious time in a really positive way.
And embrace rationalism, though? Do you think rationalism is on the rise is really what I'm getting at? Or logic or whatever?
Historically, I think we now are living in a way more rational time than at any time in the past. And it's sort of hard to see. This is one of those things where I think on a day-to-day level, it's really hard to see this, but because we tend to consider ourselves being at the end of this long history that, you know, has been through all of the Western civilization, and history has gone through all of these changes. And you had the Romans, and then you had the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and all of this kind of stuff. But actually, when you kind of zoom out and look at the picture as a whole, basically in human history, not much happened until the 18th century. And then you had this incredible explosion of both rationalism and economic development, the Industrial Revolution. You basically had the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And what we're living in now is almost a completely different world to the world before the Industrial Revolution. It's just so different. And part of that difference is that it is way more rational now than it was in the past. But that doesn't mean to say that it's, you know, that everything's rational is not, right? But I think and I think it's fundamentally a very optimistic thing to think about. It's like we are actually living in an incredibly positive, generally speaking, very peaceful, cooperative time relative to human history as a whole. It doesn't feel that way because what we see on the news is all of the death and destruction and mayhem and total irrationalism. But actually, in general, this is an incredibly peaceful, productive time to be alive. Yes, there are massive problems, huge political and economic problems still to resolve. But in general, you know, I think, yeah, we are. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's anything inevitable about it. It could all go totally down the toilet tomorrow. But, you know, I think in a way, and also it's hard to see what the entire world is doing, but you can focus on your own life and on making the biggest difference that you can in your world.
Yeah, I like that. Cool.
Thank you so much for your really interesting questions, Stephanie.
Thanks for talking about that. That was cool.
Hi, Jake. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. How's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Good. So it's just something that I have been thinking about since I heard you were speaking with Stephanie about Stoicism, and what she was asking, what you thought the appeal was, kind of the resurgence of Stoicism. And it's not like I have a fully formulated thought on it or anything, but I kind of think that there's something inherently more masculine about Stoicism. And I think that in the last century, I know this is speaking in collectivistic terms, but I think the last century has been there's been a strong move away from the masculine, from like good qualities of masculinity, to the point now where I see parents, I'm a parent myself, I have a 13-year-old son. And it's to the point now where I see parents really explaining things to 1.5-year-olds, for example, that they have no way they could possibly understand it. And everything, I guess, I just feel like men are searching for what their role is, since we've gone from kind of a really macho society to something, maybe the pendulum has swung like a long way the other way. And men are looking, because I see it as a more masculine, like I can see why it appeals more to men. There's something like to do with assertiveness and qualities that I would more typically associate with masculinity.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. So how do you think it works? Do you think that basically men are looking to Stoicism because they're looking for a new definition of what it is to be a man? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in ways I think it is. I just wonder, there's so many so many people who have been raised without fathers, like 50% of marriages in Canada end with a divorce. And it usually, almost always, I forget, it's in the 90s again, percent of the time, the children go to the mother. So a lot of men, boys, and women have grown up without kind of like that masculine role model as much. And I just wonder if sometimes men are looking, what does it mean to be a man? Like, how do you know how to behave as a man when you haven't had that role model? And I think that some of the things in Stoicism are more typically associated with men. So I just wonder if there's some kind of link there.
Do you mean because Stoicism has an emphasis, for example, on some things that would be almost cliche masculine, like enduring hardships and being able to live with discomfort in life, and that being a part of living a full life is to be able to grit your teeth and take it, so to speak? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so that is what I mean. Like those stereotypical male quality, male masculine traits, let's say. I don't know that they're I don't know that it's all good. Like I'm not saying yay Stoicism necessarily for men, but I do think that men are kind of seeking what it means to be a man, and there's a lot of the stereotypical maleness in Stoicism. So maybe that's some of the appeal.
I think that's a very interesting argument. A thought that occurs to me, though, is maybe it's bigger than that, in that one of the reasons that people are interested in Stoicism is because there is a real desire for people to find a bedrock of principles to live life by. And we live in this time where religion doesn't have much force at all in the Western world now. Even people who are nominally religious are by no means religious compared to what that would have meant 300 or 400 years ago. And so that has gone as a foundation for people to feel like, okay, here's how I determine my values and what I stand for. And a lot of people still feel like they don't know what to do without that kind of guiding set of rules to live by. And I believe that's definitely one of the appeals of all of the revolutionary movements of the 20th century, the leftism in general, communism, fascism. In a way, they were just new religions for people to adhere to, and they were deeply irrational. I think one of the nice things about Stoicism is it is a kind of system. It purports to be a set of principles to kind of live by, and people are still very much looking for that. I personally think that it is a small subset of a more fundamental set of principles, which is to do with reason and rationality and the kind of principles that come from the Enlightenment and come from a focus on using reason to determine truth and treating people as individuals, individualism. And so those are the principles that kind of are really meaningful to me. And it certainly is incredibly important to me to feel and to know that I have principles to look to determine truth from falsehood and to determine how to live my own life and what moral values mean to me and so forth. And I think one of the appeals of Stoicism is, for a lot of people, they're just desperate for that. They're looking for some principles to live by, and they probably haven't read that much into, some of the other things that I'm talking about, like the values that come from the Enlightenment, the ideas of individual liberty and rationalism. And Stoicism, one thing is it's fairly simple and it's quite easily digestible. And so maybe that's another reason why people are looking to it, because a lot of people are still lost in the post-religious world and need something to live by. And Stoicism maybe gives them, some guiding light. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I agree with literally everything you said. I actually think that all those things are religions too, like communism, socialism. I just think everything is religion. If it's not philosophy, if you're not reasoning from first principles, it's religion, right? Like if you're philosophizing in midstream, it's all religion. So even Stoicism is more rooted in rationality. I agree, though. I think that people are really before I found all this, kind of reasoning your way up from the ground, starting with nothing and ending up with, and individualist or anarchist perspective. But yeah, I think that people are really looking for a way to make sense of the world. Like when I was, I had a son, right? He's 13, as I said. And when maybe we started a business about 9 years ago. So for the first couple of years of that, I was just couldn't do anything. And then after about 2 years in, I discovered, hey, I could be listening to podcasts all night. Right. And I would hear this stuff about left and right and like just the arguments and just thinking like there has to be a rational way to decide these arguments. Like there has to be a way. And so then I went down the rabbit hole and ended up with it. So I do think that not just me, but everyone is looking for a way to make sense of the world. So maybe that is, and Stoicism, like you're saying, is a pretty straightforward way of understanding it. It's not as useful as philosophy. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I think
most people call it a philosophy, right? I guess it is.
Right, yeah. And one of the things that's important about Stoicism is that, I mean, the Stoics themselves were deeply religious, but they had an odd kind of religion, which is actually very easy to simply jettison from Stoicism. And most of the modern Stoics, the kind of revival of Stoicism, they're mostly non-religious people. They're not. They've just cut off the references to God in Stoicism, because the Stoics, although they were religious, it was a kind of very peripheral aspect of what they thought, and it's very easy to just ignore their references to God, because it was almost just like that was just the water that they swam in. They weren't even really aware of it in that sense, and their focus, because it was so very much on personal responsibility and on what you can do in your own life, the fact that they were religious didn't really matter. And I think the fact is, a lot of people who are somewhat rational and do want to find principles to live by, they're not convinced by going back to religion, because it's obvious to them that religion's a spent force, and so they're looking for something that's more rational. And Stoicism appears to be something that can provide that for them. It's kind of, if you don't want to delve into all of the other aspects of philosophy that you're talking about, then Stoicism is kind of the non-political and individual responsibility-based set of philosophic ideas that can get you going. And in many ways, that's a good thing, I think. It's just unfortunate that Stoicism is also something that, because it doesn't tackle some fundamental ethical questions, and because the Stoics were also totally ignorant of things like economics, then you can be a Stoic and you can also go into the military. You know, I mean, there are many people in the military who are Stoics, who have no problem going off and killing in foreign wars. And I think philosophically there's some big problems with doing that. But if you're a Stoic, it doesn't necessarily bother you. So that's the downside of it for me.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty big downside. So it would again kind of like, it's a prepackaged thing. It's not a framework to help you evaluate things. It's this is how you evaluate things. It's prescriptive instead of
Well, I would say the thing about Stoicism is, I would say Stoicism is about as rational as it got 2,000 odd years ago. And that's good, but there's also been a lot of development since then. And philosophy is not static. There are things that, we've definitely learned since then. For example, we've really got to terms with the idea that slavery's wrong, and the Stoics hadn't quite mastered that one yet. So, I think that's the thing about it, is if you were to stop at human knowledge 2,000 years ago, Stoicism was pretty much as good as it could get. And a lot of the, if you like, quote, good things about Christianity were simply taken from the Stoics. I mean, a lot of the things that people think are really sort of ethically good things about Christianity, the Christians that was the super high level advanced, cutting edge philosophy of the time. Around the time when Christianity started was Stoicism, and they totally absorbed everything that they could from Stoicism. So I think Stoicism has had a huge impact on Western history, if you like, but it's pretty old, and there's a lot of other good philosophical insights that came much later. I'm thinking specifically of the Enlightenment. And so for me, it's like, okay, yeah, Stoicism's nice and all, but those guys were primitives. And, we've come a long way since then. So I think there's a lot of other really, really good stuff to read up on, specifically things to do with the philosophy of war and peace and freedom and individuality and economics and so forth. So, I think there's a lot missing from Stoicism, but it's as good as it got 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I agree. I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting, because I do think, especially with how crazy things are in Canada now and everywhere, like I know we hear about that all the time, but so do you think that some of the current appeal of Stoicism is that it's simple and more rational? That, because why that? Why not communism or socialism or republicanism or anything?
Well, I would say that even communism itself now, is more popular than Stoicism. That's not to say that people are reading Karl Marx and, in reading circles and taking it all like super seriously, but there's a lot of people out there who believe that stuff still. I mean, it's, as you can see from all of the nuttiness that's going on in the universities and stuff. So I think Stoicism is popular among a small group of people who read books by Tim Ferriss and who are entrepreneurs and who think about that kind of thing. But I think if you went outside of that sort of more entrepreneurial community or group of people or people with that kind of interest, Stoicism is not really that popular compared to a lot of the nutty ideas that are still incredibly popular. I think unfortunately, there are a lot of people who do believe communist ideas and even fascistic ideas. I mean, fascism in various forms is a very popular idea and has been all the way through since, it didn't really stop at the end of the Second World War. It's just that some of the more racist elements of it got stopped, but there's many fascistic elements in Western countries. And so, unfortunately, people believe a lot of stupid stuff still.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.